We're here to celebrate the Center for Cultural Studies 35th anniversary. Our goal is to make a relatively short video to celebrate, in particular, the research cluster for the study of women of color in conflict and collaboration. My name is Dr. Charla Ogaz, and I'm so happy to be here with Dr. Ivelisse Rivera Bonilla, Dr. Michelle Habel-Payan, and Dr. Angela Davis. We were in the same cohort, 92 to 2000-ish. And so we speak only for a small portion of the cluster. There were many women of color who came through the cluster over its really 35-year history. And we're just so proud to be here. We're going to be working off of a document that Dr. Ivelisse Rivera Bonilla put together for us, tracking what we could find on the internet for the history of the cluster. And Dr. Angela Davis will walk us through it and highlight certain things that came out of the cluster. And then some of us will come in to add our comments if we would like. And then at the end, we'll make sure that the graduate student affiliates who are now full professors, Ivelisse Rivera Bonilla and Michelle Habel-Payan, have a chance to express their celebration of the cluster. Okay, so we're going to be going through the dossier now. Angela, are you ready to move us through starting in 1991, when I think the center and the cluster began?
Well, first of all, I want to also add my congratulations to the Center for Cultural Studies on the occasion of its 35th anniversary. And I'm happy to say that the Center for Cultural Studies promoted and supported the research cluster structure, and that the research cluster for the study of women of color in collaboration and conflict thrived for many years as a consequence of that support. Although we often use the shortcut Women of Color cluster, I want to emphasize that the majority of those who were affiliated with the cluster did not embrace a simplistic identitarian approach. It was really about practices. It was about research practices. It was about organizing practices, particularly since the cluster developed new relationships with a number of community organizations, both in the Santa Cruz and the Bay Area, but also in other parts of the country. And I should say that the cluster was founded shortly after I arrived on campus. And as a new faculty member, I really benefited greatly from the very provocative collective discussions that unfolded in this collective context. And I'd also like to say that many people who are probably entirely unfamiliar with the actual research cluster for the study of women of color in collaboration and conflict benefited from the projects that were supported by the cluster. And perhaps I can name two of these. One was the Women of Color Film and Video Festival, which actually preceded the organization of the cluster and was in part responsible for the idea of creating a research cluster. There was also, I think, in the year 2000, this is listed in Ivelisse's amazing overview of the work of the cluster, the conference that was called Women of Color Against Violence, a national conference which took place on the campus at UCSC, which helped to launch a new organization by the name of INCITE, INCITE, which called for a more intersectional approach to the study of and to organizing against gender violence, an approach that always placed gender in the intersectional frame of race, class, sexuality, and nation. And having said that, I also want to point out that the research cluster greatly benefited from the work of Stuart Hall. I know that the life and contributions of Stuart Hall will occupy a central space in these 35th anniversary celebrations. And I would like to point out that many of the students and faculty who participated in the cluster over the years benefited from Stuart Hall's analysis of identity and from his from his work overall, from his enormous body of work and the work of the Birmingham School as well. So with that, let me see if I can find as we see in the CV that Ivelisse has created, the cluster was founded in 1991. And by 1994, an issue of the Journal of the Center for Cultural Studies, Inscriptions, as a matter of fact, it was the seventh issue, Inscription 7, entitled Enunciating Our Terms, Women of Color in Collaboration and Conflict, was edited by key cluster members, Maria Ochoa and Teresia Teawa. And as I evoke Teresia's name and the centrality of her work early on in the cluster, I should point out that Teresia is one of 3 members of the cluster who are no longer with us. And so I think it would be appropriate to dedicate this evocation of the work of the cluster to Teresia and also to Darshan, and help me with the
Darshan Campos.
Darshan Campos, and also Catriona Esquivel. Now, you all should jump in.
I was hoping to comment on the intellectual community that the cluster was. I went to Santa Cruz, coming from Puerto Rico, and for me, it was very meaningful to find in Santa Cruz a community of women of color that helped me to look at my way of doing research and thinking about myself in different ways, right? And to find a supportive community that helped me to go through grad school, as we were involved in many activities such as the Film Fest and the creation of courses that were carving a special space for women of color in academia at the moment. Was really made a difference in my experience of grad school. The women of color research cluster was very important for me in making sense of that experience of researching from the cultural critique model that was proposed from both programs. I'm going to stop there for now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Michelle Habel-Payan, and I became part of the cluster when I arrived in 1992. So 1992, 93 was the first, my first year at Santa Cruz. And actually I came through the literature department, but I found my people in the women of color in conflict and collaboration cluster. And so what I remember it was so life-changing to arrive and to find this community of really exciting scholars who were, everyone was so young at the time and so full of energy, and really we felt like we had power. We were within a context that we were made to feel that our words mattered, that our work mattered, as far out as it seemed at the time to other more conventional programs. That we were encouraged to follow our hearts in terms of where our research and where our commitments to social change were. So I'll talk specifically about the inscriptions issue, because that was really life-changing for me to be, as a newer graduate student, to be invited into this process. And for me, this speaks all to the amazing mentorship mentorship kind of mechanism or community, mostly that the cluster became for me and many other people's. And so to learn about the process of first going through what was going to be the theme, trying to think about, how we came up with enunciating our terms, collaboration and conflict, and then to go through the process of publishing was prepared me for my academic career, because I was able to do that with a lot of support and not a lot of high risk, but a lot of payoff, because there were graduate students who had been in the program who had skills and they were sharing it with us through the doing. And so that amazing Inscriptions #7 was the first publication for many of us. But what also I thought, and I still teach it because there's a really important piece. There's many important pieces in there, but I still feel for today, and especially the political pressures that we're under. There's a piece that Angela and Elizabeth Martinez wrote called Coalition Building Among People of Color. And I feel that really captured the sentiment of the moment and what we really took away as we all went our separate ways. But the woman of color, as Angela said, the cluster was less about a demographic and it was a method. It was a method of solidarity. So it was a method of approaching academics. So I taught that. I've been teaching that. I make that statement still today, because there's so much, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what maybe identity politics has meant in the past and what it means today. So always thinking about the cluster as this place of solidarity, not about identity politics. But we were in a moment in the 90s, in that heady moment when when post-structuralist theorists and feminist theorists were thinking against essentialism, right? And thinking about how identity wasn't about these essential attributes, but rather they were constructs. And here's where cultural studies and Stuart Hall comes into the mix, right? So we're talking about the construction of subjectivity and what that means in the building of coalition. And I feel this moment, and I feel what we were able to go really far in terms of our scholarship and developing the fields in the many ways that we went, absolutely, as feminists. And then we're in a moment where it feels like, wow, the backlash really put us back almost to the 90s, where we're having to rehash these questions about identity and being siloed. And we feel that, and now we're in cancel culture with social media. And so I feel like some of these early tools that we did develop, and yes, to be updated, but we have such a beautiful foundation that obviously went on to support Insight and other, the film festival and all the other amazing projects, even the projects I worked on, the Women Who Walk, Making Scenes, Building Communities here. But that is the heart, was that we were trying to build coalition, and we were real about it in the title, because it's women of color, not in peace and happiness, right? It's in conflict and collaboration. So that was never that we had an easy. What was easy was the community part. And I remember, learning salsa from Evelise, or the times when we would, the deep hanging to get to know each other so that we could do the hard work. of figuring out what it meant to be in collaboration when there was inevitably going to be conflict, because we were not coming all from the same place. We all had different ideas about what how we should get to where we wanted to go, but we had enough of a commitment to creating something bigger, greater than ourselves, so the pieces that we brought could create something greater than the sum of each piece. And I feel that, and even though we didn't necessarily always like each other all the times, and so, but what really kept it flowing was that commitment and solidarity. And I think that's what that first issue tried to show. I co-wrote a piece with Jennifer Gonzalez. I'd never co-written an academic piece before. It was amazing. So I think for us, and I'll stop soon, but I think for us, the cluster was kind of a lab of practice, that we were given this space within the center. We had an incredible mentor, Angela, who believed in us. And as crazy as I felt sometimes it sounded, our proposals were, Angela had faith in what that we could pull off whatever we felt we needed to produce, whether it was in our scholarship or in our programming or in our activism. But I just want to communicate, there was such an aliveness and such a joy that carried us through the hard times. And that here we are today, and many of us, we continue to support each other through the academy, because the academy is an institution. And so it is a constant battle and struggle to make sure that we keep this place open for those who come after us, because as we look forward to our retirements, we want to make sure that this continues. So I'll stop there.
I'll just briefly say, while we're on this run, that for me, cultural studies was learning about culture in motion and culture being struggled over. And that meant that individuals had agency. And that was very liberating for me to come out of philosophy with a long history of patriarchy, and to start to see that we could struggle even over those ancient texts, and that what I contributed was important because I could get in there and struggle with meaning on how things would be defined, my own identity, others' identities, our projects. And then to have the source of funding and the outstanding leadership of Angela telling us, carte blanche, do it. Whatever you dream of for this cluster, do it. And we did, and we came together and we did argue, and we did have personality differences and identity politics differences. And yet we would produce these outstanding platforms for women of color to be seen and to be agents of culture and history, and to be able to project their own images in particular for the film festivals and the publications. And the cluster cranked and cranked and cranked and cranked. And it was all for us students, unpaid hours, loving hours of wanting to project and struggle in culture and struggle for meaning and struggle for our own identities and those of our sisters, so to speak. And so it was just a life-changing experience. And I want to just recognize how many of us came through the cluster and survived much better than we would have without each other.
Absolutely.
I want to comment to that because I think I also want to acknowledge the importance of the cluster in recognizing us, each other in our complexity. That we were not only graduate students, but we were graduate students with lives, right? And that we had to nurture many spaces, alongside our academic work. Right, and like Michelle said, we learn from each other, we fed each other, we accompany each other through, the different steps of our grad programs, but also through our life experiences, right? And that it's something that I have taken with me throughout my life, and that I try now to work with my students, right? Not only see them as students, but as complex selves that are living many different things, and they bring that to the classroom, and they bring that to their activism. They bring all of themselves to the, to all the different spheres in which I share with them.
Let me also comment before we go back to the dossier and just make sure we review what the cluster accomplished in not just our years, but in all of its years as we've discovered. The dossier is probably not complete. We welcome any contributions to it to make it more complete as we continue to try to document the history of this group, the cluster. Let me also just say, off of what Michelle said, my first year we did see Betita Martinez in conversation with Angela Davis. And that was really life changing to see two different ethnic women coming together with long histories of activism and celebrating each other and discussing intellectually what crossed them positively and the differences in their struggles. And we got to see it role modeled for us. And that was in our first year. And I remember just coming out of there like, wow, who knew that, a leading Chicana, and this was new to us. It surely had been happening with Angela's life forever, but for us to see a leading Chicana activist in conversation with Angela Davis was just breathtaking. And so I would just like to encourage other folks to organize these sorts of coalitional moments that role model for students what it means to think deeply about each other's agendas and histories. So I'd like to thank Angela for that as well, and Betita, of course, to memorialize.
Yes.
And let's also remember that Gloria Anzaldúa was on our campus.
That's right.
At that time. And that I think we were, all inspired by Gloria's work. And there's this notion of collaboration, led us to think about possibilities of collaborating over lines that usually prohibited egalitarian work. So that, one of the projects included collaborative classes that were taught by a professor's student team. I can remember that I taught one of those courses with Catriona. And then I think Nancy Chin taught it with, maybe you'll remember, Evelise.
With Maylee Blackwell.
With Maylee.
And Nefertiti Tadiar also taught one with Laura Kuo.
Yes.
And that was actually an early project that sought to re-envision what it meant to engage deeply in collaboration, and how we were trying to imagine what it might be like to break down the hierarchical structures that usually demand a very different kind of relationality, linking students and professors.
Again, the content was so incredible because the focus really was building solidarity through the academic research or as a scholar activist. And so that theme was there in the curriculum, it was there in the mentorship, and it was there in the practice. So it was being, as you said, Charlotte, it was being modeled all the time. And it was a feminist cultural study or feminist of color cultural studies model that was being utilized, built out, advanced. So yeah, it really did it and proof of concept. It worked, right? So bringing this idea of collectivity into academic mentorship was something pretty, I would say, probably novel at the time, or at least unconventional. Maybe still is, but is really powerful and is a reproducible model for how to really support cohorts that are, whose research maybe isn't recognized by other disciplines so easily, but when it enters this space, it's absolutely understood and can be nurtured and supported.
Mhm.
And, one other thing, I think perhaps particularly because we're doing this on the occasion of the 35th anniversary of the Center for Cultural Studies, we should make explicit the deep interdisciplinarity
Mhm.
of the work that happened under the auspices of the cluster. An interdisciplinarity that embraced not only the existing disciplines, but one that drew upon resources and intellectual inspiration and certainly ideas that emanated outside of the academy, so that many of the projects that all of you undertook had to do with crossing those boundaries and thinking about interdisciplinarity in a way that often went beyond what was generally considered to be interdisciplinary.
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And I think that's where the Center for Cultural Studies and the research cluster really enabled that meeting of the minds, because we were literally coming from across different disciplines as grad students. And so, I was doing performance art, but also what was that connection with oral history and ethnography that I used, right? So thinking about how anthro was coming through, and but also always from a feminist perspective, right? And so HISCON at that time was heavy with feminist thinkers and scholars, and that was really influential. I thought when I first arrived to Santa Cruz, what was UC Santa Cruz, what was so different than where I had come from, UC San Diego, was it felt as if there were there was an alignment with the feminist ethos across classes, so that when you TA'd as a student, you felt that you weren't struggling to talk about feminism, that other courses and other professors had done that, had laid that groundwork, and you could just come in and really advance the conversations. And then leaving Santa Cruz realizing, oh, that was a special place and moment, because it's absolutely not like that in other institutions. So I think that also, Bettina Apdecker, right? That I just have very, not so many memories, but I know it was such a strong campus for feminist research in general, even before the cluster existed. So, yeah, and that
And so,
infused the cultural studies. But yeah.
so something along those lines could be said also about the conversations about race and colonialism, right? That were also part of the conversation, and that wasn't the starting point of many of the places where we came from before coming to Santa Cruz.
Absolutely. I mean, and to think about intersectionality, right? So that was almost a given at the time there, right? So it was the ocean we swam in. Though, even though it was the water that we swam in, when we left that water, we had to figure out how to find others who were in that conversation. We weren't in the space that was as concentrated as where we were in the cluster and in the Center for Cultural Studies. So that it was definitely a process. Yes.
I was thinking it might be helpful to share some of the titles of the various projects. And I'll begin, of course, with the publication you already evoked, Inscriptions 7, enunciating our terms, women of color in collaboration and conflict. And incidentally, a couple of you have said in conflict and collaboration,
Yes, I did say that.
right? And of course, there's a kind of meaning to that, because we did emphasize how important it was to recognize conflict and not assume that conflict would destroy the work that we were doing. So in many ways, we centralize how to address difference and conflict, and how to make difference and conflict a creative force, to kind of borrow from Audre Lorde, rather than a destructive one. But in any event, inscription 7, enunciating our terms, women of color in collaboration and conflict. There is also the film festival in 1995, which was entitled Out of Bounds, Subversive Geographies. 1996, the film festival was entitled Rupture. And then, of course, we had the series of collaboratively taught courses under the rubric of history of consciousness, because they were all HISCON courses, we should also point out. Women of color, genders, and sexualities, which Catriona and I taught. Nefertiti Tadiar and Laura Quote also taught a women of color, genders, and sexualities. And then I guess around 1998 or so, maybe even earlier, there was a very specific interest in visual culture, which led to, it led to a course that was taught by Nancy Chen and May Lee Blackwell called Women of Color and Visual Culture. And of course, that had to do with the influence of the film festival and other kinds of visual culture on the cluster. But there was this project which most of the cluster members participated in around 2003, 2004, was it? The book project, Beyond the Frame.
I think it was
Well-
2000.
Mhm.
I think the three of us were gone already
Okay.
or
Well,
finishing.
the publication was in 2005.
Okay.
And so the work happened, I think, 2 or 3 years before that. Actually, the cluster hosted a conference called Women of Color and Visual Representations in the spring of 1999.
Yes.
And that was when the initial drafts of the work that was eventually included in Beyond the Frame, those initial drafts were collectively discussed. And I remember we invited a number of scholars, prominent scholars from various universities to participate in the process of collectively engaging with these manuscripts. And then in 2000, there was the film festival and the conference of the same name, The Color of Violence. And we've talked about the fact that that gave rise to a movement that is still central, I think, to the progressive work that is being done against gender violence throughout the country. In 2001, the film festival was entitled Eclipse Toward a Decolonizing Cinema. 2002, the film festival was entitled Corpus, Remembering, Relocating, and Reinscribing Ourselves. 2005, Disrupting Borders, Seeing Silences and Imagining Transformations. 2005 was also the publication date of the Women of Beyond the Frame, by the way.
Mhm.
2006, Film Festival entitled Regenerations. 2008, Bodies in Flight, Migration and Transit. And I think this is where we, at least in terms of the overview that Evelise produced, this is where the cluster begins to look back on its history since the 1990s. I thought it was interesting to share the titles of some of the projects that emerged out of the cluster over time.
Absolutely. Let us also mention here in 2016 to 2017, we don't have a whole lot of information on this, but the cluster was reinvented as a UC-wide cluster and had students from Santa Cruz, Davis, and Berkeley that came together in the spirit of the original research cluster as the Women of Color in Collaboration and Conflict Graduate Working Group. And they published an essay, I believe. Oh, no, they published a journal. They co-authored and co-edited a journal on the theme of witnessing and testimony. So it would be interesting to hear how they picked up the project and ran with it, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that even during those early days, we were attempting to think critically about the terms we were using. We were questioning the use of the term women of color, particularly in the aftermath of a period during which the term U.S. Third World women had a greater impact. And of course, we link that to Chela Sandoval, who wrote a number of articles about U.S. Third World women. But I think it's important to emphasize that we never assume that the term women of color was a term that would last forever. We constantly problematized it and talked about what we meant by it and tried not to sort of sink into a purely identitarian assumption about that term. And now it has a very interesting history. It has a history that is related to the work that was done in the UK by a number of scholar activists who had trained with and worked with the Birmingham School. The conversations about the use of the term Black as an anti-imperialist term, as opposed to an identitarian term that during a certain period embraced vast numbers of, or I would say vast numbers of women identified into that term because of its anti-imperialist resonances. And those conversations, I think, have relevance today. As we also think back about the use of women of color and how it's used today, both in terms of the popular sense and how how we're constantly struggling against the identitarian resonances of these ways in which we describe ourselves and our relationalities. Wonderful.
I just wanna, say that the Center for Cultural Studies was one of the reasons that I went to Santa Cruz, even though I was in another program. And I'm really grateful to have found a community in the cluster that sustained me through grad school and beyond, and your mentorship as well. So thank you. And
Thank you. It's interesting to see how the cluster had a life of its own, and
Yeah.
and continued even after many of us had left. So, and I think that when we think about feminist methodologies, we have to, take into consideration the ways in which the cluster survived that don't necessarily, require the conventional structure
Mhm.
and the actual cluster formation continuing to exist.
Mhm.
I think feminist research methodology ask us to think more deeply about what influence is all about, what institutionalization is all about, and how this work often survives in ways that are not really legible to the academy.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the work there, I don't think we didn't realize we were so young and trying to figure out the institution ourselves and what our lives were going to be, that we didn't really understand the power or the impact in the moment of it. And it's only upon reflection that we can see, wow, it's been incredible and lasting. And it may not, like you said, be legible in traditional ways, but its impact is going to continue for many, many, many years, as long as we have to struggle in the institution and in life. So yeah, just want to say thank you, Angela, for having faith in us and our collective power. It was really, it was really something to have a scholar who believed in us and who you weren't afraid to let us make mistakes because you had faith enough in us that we could figure out how to get through the mistakes, right? How to get through the mistakes. It's not that you ever gave us any direct answers, right? Gave us lots of support and advice and good feedback, excellent feedback, but always with the caveat that you said you need to make it work and figure it out on your own. I don't have all the answers, but together we can come up with an answer. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah.
Let me also mention just real quickly this other publication that you had found, Michelle, which I feel like is one of those maybe decentralized expressions of the cluster. It was that article published just in 2014 in Hypatia, Building on the Edge of Each Other's Battles, a Feminist of Color Multidimensional Lens. And those authors were not, I didn't find their names anywhere in it. They call themselves the Santa Cruz Feminist of Color Collective. And they definitely document a lot of what we just talked about, including attending Angela's courses. So I was really also refreshed to see that this story it's shared and it's got a long history. And it's beautiful to see that in 2014, that would have been almost what, 20 years after we were there flourishing, that women are still inheriting, feminists are still inheriting this history and inspired by it and publishing it. So I want to mention that too, even though I'm not sure what its relationship to the cluster was, but clearly Santa Cruz Feminist of Color Collective is
And what's interesting is that you don't find any of the names anywhere.
Exactly. I love that.
Yeah.
Which is a comment, I think, on the kind of individualism that normally characterizes scholarly work as a scholarly work in the way um, it's usually done.
Sure.
So
And they reference the Combahee River Collective as a model for that,
yes,
straight out of Black feminism. So, you know, it's just lovely decades longer to see these threads being sewn together still, and inspiring so many of us.
At the same time that, I mean, we want it to be remembered. We want it to be archived for the future, right? So not that it's the set in stone way to do it, but just that to recognize what we did, that we were here and that we made an impact and that it mattered. And that it mattered. Yeah.
It would be cool if we could package it up in a bottle with a methodology and kind of ship it around the world.
Well, I think
And
about and I feel like we weren't about disposing anybody in the collective. Hopefully, I mean, I know that there was there could be tensions, right? But I think the bottom line was that it was mostly existed so that we could exist together and that could remain and not be cast out from the institution, because it was so difficult to be a young scholar in graduate school doing this kind of thinking, within our field. So yeah, but thinking about just drawing the lines or the kind of foundational work, or just the dialogues that build and build. So just wanted to say that.